podcast from Aydan and Mike is, I think it's really cool, and that is what I wanted to say.
Two and a mic. Two, 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 two and a mic. Two, 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 two and a mic. Aydan and I want to talk about presidents. We actually want to talk about recent presidents, what's going on with them, and why are they as they are. We want to talk about customs, precedents, and protocol, because everyone talks about how Trump broke with tradition and did this or did that. But where does this tradition all come from? And was it right in the first place? Also, when we look back, how we look back depends so much on what we are taught. Is everything we think we know anywhere near the truth? Does that truth even matter? We wanted to put into context just how good, bad, or whatever recent presidents have been by setting up our own grading system. Each and every president will have an episode dedicated to them, and we will mark them on the basis of what they did. We will not be kind, we will be objective. Aydan, by the way, is great in finding his way through murky waters in the most delightfully expressive manner. Thank you so much, Aydan. I hope you enjoy it. Aydan, thank you very much for joining me again. It's always fun to have you. How are you?
I'm doing great, Zach. How are you?
Good, thank you. Good. I cannot complain. I recently spent the weekend in Cologne with my brothers and my uncle,
Nice.
drinking copious amounts of Kölsch, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with Kölsch beer, but it's basically served in 200 milliliter glasses. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, and the thing is, your glass cannot remain empty. So as soon as you finish it, somebody comes around and replenishes it or gives you a new glass altogether. And
Wow.
you end up drinking copious amounts and you don't even know it. And it's
Yeah,
wonderful.
that does sound like a really good time. Like, that sounds
Mm.
dangerously fun.
It was definitely entertaining, I have to say. But yeah, but you've also had a celebration. You've celebrated your 22nd birthday, so congratulations for that.
Thank you very much. I made it another year, and I'm gonna just keep chugging, I guess.
That's the way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we always get like a colorful conversation with you. So I really enjoy the way that you express yourself, and it's very different to how I sort of the communication that I have with other people, and that is brilliant. Yeah, so I've always
Cool.
said I love diversity, and diversity comes in every different kind of manner, or as it were, or measure. And so diversity of opinions and conversational style and rhythm is also something to be appreciated. So thank you
For
for that too.
sure. Yeah, thank
Uh,
you. Appreciate
yeah.
that.
So we were talking, I can't remember when, and I wanted to ask you, I think we were probably debating whether or not we should talk about Trump. And within that conversation, we sort of collectively got to this idea that it would be unfair to simply do an episode criticizing Trump and comparing him to other presidents without actually talking about the other presidents.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Because we were kind of going back and forth between like, because we have done a lot of like shitting on Donald Trump, and we were kind of wanting to balance it out with Clinton and talk about the Democrats a little bit more as well, just to kind of be like, hey, the Democrats also aren't good. And we were thinking about like trying to rate them, and then it was like, well, how do we like stack them up to other presidents? And so then it was just the like, let's just go through all of them. And so yeah, I think I'm excited to go through like presidents that I've never heard about, don't really know too much about. I'm sure that there's going to be like one really really short episode, because we have a president who died like like a few weeks into his term in office. Like there are going to be like some interesting things that I'm just excited to dig into. So I'm stoked about it.
Yeah, we're gonna have a great chat. I mean, we're starting with George Washington,
Hmm.
of course, which is probably the sensible option, seeing as he was the first. Um, and then we'll go through them all. As you say, a lot of them we probably haven't even heard of. Some of them are
Yeah.
quite sinister, and others have a great reputation. And we're going to try to, yeah, identify whether or not they deserve the good reputation that they have.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So I mean, yeah, George Washington. He's your guy. He's Mr. Number One.
He's my guy. I'm an American patriot, and he's my guy. He The whole time that I was doing research on him, I was just like, I can't really find out too much about you that's like particularly interesting. And that was really just kind of like you're very like stock standard dude, right place, right time. Like you were born into the right family and you just kind of played your cards right. Like it didn't really feel like he's a super charismatic leader, really soft spoken, like tall motherfucker and like commanded the respect of everybody, but like this dude really just wanted to hang out at Mount Vernon and just like kick back with his slaves. And I mean, like that's the big thing that I would like to talk about is like the way that like Mount Vernon operated with slaves and like I there was some stuff that I learned and I'm not like defending his slavery by any means whatsoever because it's not like when I remember learning about George Washington, I didn't know that the dude had slaves. I would have been nice to know. But like he was a lot more liberal with his slaves compared to a lot of other slave owners during the time. Um, like, I mean, he allowed his slaves to go over to other plantations to visit friends and family. Um, they had Sunday off, which was pretty typical, but like they didn't go through punishments often. They were very sparse and like they just didn't happen super often. And I'm not saying that that's like a great thing by any means, but just comparatively to how a lot of other slaves were treated during the time, it felt kind of like George Washington, like of course he had the monetary gain in his head because he's a Virginian planter, like that's just of course he's going to be thinking about that, but like by the time that he died, his slaves were freed a year later, before Martha's death even, which was in the will. So like, there's just like interesting stuff about his slaves and the way that Mount Vernon operated that just like I was like I didn't know any of this stuff. This is the interesting stuff to me.
Mm.
Um,
Well,
yeah.
how did Mount Vernon operate? If you can name just sort of a couple of things, shed a bit of light on it, because I didn't come across that in my research, so it would be great to sort of fill in that gap.
Yeah, I can't remember what kind of crops they grew, but I'm pretty sure Virginia at the time was a tobacco colony. So I imagine that they were probably doing tobacco. Um, but by the time that George Washington had passed away, there were 300 and hold on. I think it was like 318 slaves. He had 318 slaves, and like he when he was a kid he had a few slaves that like his father like I think he inherited through one of his parents, um but like just in like the normal operations of Mount Vernon, like George Washington wasn't at Mount Vernon often, so the slaves didn't always have stuff to do. Like of course they had work to do, but they were also able to be very liberal in the stuff that they did. So like they stole and they set fires to the crops and they did stuff slowly so that way they could kind of just buy more time to do more stuff that they wanted to do. Um, and they weren't caught super often because they're like George Washington wasn't there and he didn't really give a fuck. Like he had moments where he did, and he did say like a few times that like some of the punishments that were given out were appropriate, and a lot of them were not like they were like whippings, and like he was like that is the just punishment for this crime, and like so like it's not like he was the bee's knees when it comes to being a slave owner, but like in those operations it was just a lot more or not even a lot, but just more liberal. In fact, the slave population had increased it was at 28% when, like, in Fairfax County, which is where Mount Vernon is, when I think it was in 1754, and then by the end of the Revolutionary War, the population of enslaved people was at 40%. And that was in like direct relation to Mount Vernon's increase of slaves. And it was through George Washington's marriage of Martha that he inherited like 120 or something slaves, like through that marriage. And he just suddenly had a bunch more slaves. Like I he did purchase more slaves as he grew older, but a lot, like, Martha had the majority of the slaves, which I thought was a very interesting thing.
Mm. Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, we read history books or we read through these historical accounts, and the buying and selling of people. Even when I come across it in fiction, it is such a distasteful activity.
Yeah.
And I mean, nowadays, people can say that the way that they work, it's akin to slavery, but it's optional slavery. There's always a way out. There's always a variation that we can apply more or less always, as in it's not universal. Unfortunately, there are still many parts of the world where, there is essentially enforced slavery, but definitely not in the West, I would say. And so, we have to realize, even though George Washington, may have represented or been represented as a sort of liberal slave owner, he was still a slave.
He's still a fucking slave owner. Like,
Yeah.
it's not like it changes the fact that the dude owned individual people as property and used them to his, like, benefit, like, the entire time. Like, he didn't free his slaves until after his death because he was like, I'd like to still make money off of Mount Vernon. Like, he's still a fucking slave owner. Like, I'd like to reiterate, I'm not trying to defend like the slavery. It just felt really important to try to like put that out there, just because that was something that I didn't know about. And he is also the only president that ever set free his slaves. Like, we don't have any other founding fathers or any other fucking president who was like, yep, and I'm gonna free my slaves now. Like, George Washington was the only dude who did that. He did it after his presidency, but he was the only one who did that. Because the next few presidents that we're going to talk about, specifically Jefferson, whoa, dude, like, heavy slaver. Like, it just, you get into these founders and it's just like, dog, like, how can we still be like, yeah, this guy's awesome. Like, just at least teach the history, so that way when I come into this stuff later on in my life, I'm not like, whoa, what the heck? The dude who I've been like telling everybody he's awesome is not at all. Like, fuck. Because that happens. Like, and it's
Invariably.
happening.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you get people who are patriotic and say, this isn't the world that our founding fathers created. Okay, yeah, sure, fair enough. But I mean, your founding fathers had slaves. Is that the world you also would like to maintain?
And their wives couldn't vote. You're still like that shit? Like, what the fuck, dog? Like, you're outing yourself in such a weird way that's just like, when people are like, man, the founders didn't want this country to be like this. Like, I want the country to be how the founders wanted it. It's like, dog, you are outing yourself in a lot of ways. Like, you're outing yourself for being racist. You're outing yourself for being a misogynist. Like, it's just like, fuck, man. Like, these people are not good people. They are just like right place, right time. They had moments of like, they have good moments, as every individual does. Like, every human being has good moments and bad moments. But like, overall, if you're still owning slaves throughout this entire period of your good doing, like, I feel like that just kind of negates it the entire time, Like,
yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, it's how closely guarded some of these sort of negative stories are with regards to George Washington. Because if you watch a documentary on his life and his, what he did, you only hear the good things. And they say that I watched a couple sort of in preparation for this conversation, and it's like, he was extremely, as you said, softly spoken. He's tall, he's athletic, one of the most dynamic. He's such a good horse rider, and this and that. And people asked, should we call you your greatness? Blah blah blah. What should we call you? Because obviously he's the first president, so nobody really knows how do you address this guy. And he
Yeah.
said, "Mr. President." So, he's so humble. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, humility, blah blah blah. But let's try to make things a bit more objective. Straight away, that's what you that's what you bring in. That's it.
I couldn't help but just like as soon as I'm learning about it, I'm just like, damn, dude, like I don't know. It's disappointing to realize that we're taught all this stuff and then it's just not the full truth. And I don't know, it disappoints me every single time because every time I'm like doing some research, I'm like doing a little bit of extra, like, oh, I don't know about this small thing. And then I look into it and I'm like, wait, what the fuck? What? Like, why isn't either like talked about in that way or like why isn't it talked about period? Like it's always framed in a way to make it look like America is the good guy or that it's just not talked about at all. And it's always just like, fuck, man. Like I want the whole story, man. Like I want it all and I don't get it. Like as soon as I was doing my research for this, I looked up like fuck, I can't remember. It was just like it was like bad things about George Washington or something like that. Like things that George Washington has done that were not good. Something along those lines. It took a while to find anything because it feels like it is kind of like buried. You know what I mean? Like because it probably is being buried. Like it's probably like there are so many websites that are just like George Washington's awesome. George Washington's the greatest. He's the first president who's ever like, and just like you have to sift through all of that garbage to find the like stuff that feels like it's not being talked about at all. And like I didn't find much, and I was very disappointed about that.
Mm. Well, I mean, it is unfortunately, living in sort of the post-truth era that we are, that even if you uncover something which is perhaps not complimentary, people say, Psh, that's it. You believe everything you see on the internet. And it's like, yeah, okay. I mean, because in that case, let's not believe anything.
Yeah.
But, on the other hand, as you say, there's a lot of positivity about George Washington, and we want to be objective, and I'm sure we'll touch on a few more of the positive things. But if somebody just wants to hear positivity about the presidents, then this isn't going to be the series for you. But if you want to hear perhaps some of the other elements of what these guys represented, then okay, let's give it a go. So he's number one.
Yeah.
Basically, that obviously means that there's no set agenda. He kind of walks into his position because there was no White House at the time. There was no Washington at the time as a city. So he kind of walks into the role and then, what do I do? And so, I can imagine like any sort of person who, creates a startup company and is given a bucket load of cash now and sits down in their office and they say, okay, now what do I do?
Yeah.
And then you undertake your activities. George Washington was probably maybe one of the biggest startup managers, as it were, if we can consider it that way.
Yeah.
And he set a lot of precedents. Some were good and perhaps some were not so good.
Yeah.
So I mean, he was good at delegating. I'm told he was a good judge of character. He knew where to find talent, but he was a bit of a gambler too. A bit of a risk taker, and at the same time, he was a surveyor by trade. And so therefore, he partially designed the city of Washington. He partially designed the White House. He also helped design uniforms. He was an interior decorator as well, so he kind of designed a bit of this and a bit of that.
Yeah.
Now, on the one hand, people say that he was good at delegating, and on the other hand, he's doing everybody else's job. So, I mean, do you know
Which
what I
one is
mean?
it? Yeah, which one is it, dog? Yeah. I mean, like, I thought that the surveying thing was very interesting because if I'm not mistaken, he's doing all that surveying for the British, and then like later on, he ends up fighting for a British commander during the French Indian War, and like for that to kind of come full circle later on for him to like, and now I've got my army and I'm gonna fuck you guys up, like his his tactic of like because like he was kind of just appointed to be the leader of the Continental Army, and he was like, okay, like I'm gonna do this, and he had the help of like you said, like he was good at delegating and figuring like finding good people to do things for him, like places where he didn't stride and wasn't like the strongest, it felt like he usually could find somebody to do that thing and do it better than he could. And so like General Knox, he ended up being his Secretary of War once Washington became president. And like during the Revolutionary War, he ended up being like, "Hey, Knox, I need you to go to like steal some artillery from the British and bring it back. And if you can do this, like, I'm gonna keep you around." And he ended up doing it, and it pretty much like shifted the war from that point forward. Like from that point, like George Washington's main goal, like strategy with the British was just to like he kind of took war in an unconventional route compared to how it was typically done in the past. Like in those times, it was like the British were lining up in like squares and they were like lining up to fire at them. And the American like Continental Army kind of just wasn't doing that at all. Like they were ambushing them in trees, they were falling back slowly and attacking unexpectedly. Like they just kind of were doing things in whatever, like if I'm not mistaken, George Washington is quoted as like his only thing that he could do was just to harass the British. Like, and that's what ended up letting him win was just that general harassment and just like, I'm gonna fuck with you until you're kind of just like at a point where you can't do anything. Like you're an entire ocean away. What the fuck are you gonna do about it? Like it's gonna take months for people to get over here. Sorry. Like it's interesting to like his wartime career is kind of interesting. Like he was involved in many great battles. I mean, he is the leader. It was 6 long years of just fucking just like some of the worst sounding stuff that I could imagine, just like brutal cold winters, like marching through swamps and like just oh my god, just a whole and like the whole time having like your wife and children just kind of following you in a parade behind you, like cleaning your clothes as you're fucking going into a battlefield. Like wow, man, that sounds horrible. Like, and that the fact that like it's the whole family coming along on this like trip, like fuck, man, it just seems like a crazy experience, and I would not want to do that. Like, I mean, if you have a like something worth fighting for and you genuinely feel that passionate about it, I can understand it, but like. I don't know if I can understand it for this one. Like, you're taxing me a little too high. Hmm.
Yeah, I mean the thing is also you mentioned his sort of role in sort of fighting essentially for the British, but then also predominantly against the British.
Mhm.
Um, but he wasn't the successful military leader that he's painted out to be either. So he lost
Yeah.
more battles than he won.
Yeah.
And with regards to the War of Independence, as in, they were very close to giving up, and then they had a surprise victory. I think it was New Orleans, but I can't remember. Um, and that kind of turned the tide, as it were.
Yeah.
I think I think skirmishing was very much the sort of the tactics that they had, because they didn't have that the British military rigidity, the training, and all of that had preceded hundreds of years of military. So of course it's going to be different. But I think this also is a great example of British arrogance. And it's something which is quite well represented in the movie Patriot. So I'm not going to claim for one moment that that Mel Gibson's effort should be considered absolute fact or any kind of historical relevance, but they do well in communicating this arrogance of the Brits. Yeah, but what are they? This skirmisher. Yeah, this band of militia. You can't hold an army with militia.
Yeah.
And I think this very much led to, was perhaps one of the big reasons why the Brits lost that war.
I think that's very true. Like, it's this feeling of, because I mean, like you had mentioned, like for the past century, like even longer, like Britain had been building up the most impressive naval fleet in the world at the time. Like Britain's navy is known throughout the world, and is, if in my opinion, historically they are known for having one of the most impressive navies and militaries. Like, they don't fuck around, and they didn't fuck around. But it was that, I think you're right with like that arrogance of like, what the heck are a bunch of farmers gonna do? Like, we're the British military. The fuck? And then they're just kind of harassing them and kind of coming at them in weird angles, and then also getting the French to help them out. Like, having the allies of the French became like so pivotal at the very end of just like, and now we have the backing of like a real country. Because like at this point in time, America's not a real country. It is just a bunch of fucking colonies and people who have one shared like and common ideology, and that's just, I want to have, like, I want this land, I want to keep this, and I want to stay here, and I don't want somebody to like kind of push me down in any way. And like that cause is enough to get people riled up and fucking furious and beat the British back into a place where they can't do anything. Like 6 years is a long time to be at war. That's a long, like that's a long time to just be doing anything really. And to just be like, I'm gonna keep doing this because fuck you, man. Like, I want to be an American. Like, that's crazy. Like, some part of me in the inside is like, that's so badass. Like, but at the same time, I'm like, God damn it, that's so dumb. Like, it's just so, I don't know. I get these contradictory feelings when I think about like the past and like our founding as an American. Like, because the whole time that I'm taught, like, it's like this awesome badass thing and America's so cool, and then it's like, but like what these guys are really fighting about kind of isn't that dope. Like, it's just not that awesome. Like, you are seriously just kind of fighting to continue the right to build this land out, push these people away, and keep on like having slaves and shit. Like, you're not standing for things that I stand for as an individual. Like, I don't stand for any of that shit. Like, I don't stand for slavery. I don't stand for Western expansion. I don't stand for being a misogynist. Like, and these were all things that these people were like, yes, yes, yes. And that sucks, man, because like I said, the whole time that we're taught, it's just like this is awesome. This is so cool and so laid back and like not crazy sounding at all. And it sounds crazy, man. It sounds crazy.
Well, I mean, you mentioned a lot of things there, and there are some, interesting sort of historical parallels in some of these elements. So, what you were talking about Western expansion. So, there was this policy back in the day called Manifest Destiny.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I know about that. I'm an American.
Yeah, and the way that I see that, I mean, I haven't studied Manifest Destiny, but I look at it and I think to myself, okay, in this case, manifest is definitely a verb. So they're basically telling people, you go out there and you take control of your destiny. So this is basically the expansion element of that particular policy.
Yep.
as you say, France came to the aid of this fledgling concept of an independent America. George Washington actually became an honorary Frenchman in 1792 as well. And a lot of the concept, excuse me, of manifest destiny also has some kind of connection with the Francia, which later became France, also the Franks came over from Francia, and then eventually their name was given to the French. And so there is a connection in many ways between this concept of manifest destiny and the French aristocracy, even dare I say it, the Merovingian kings and dynasty and so on. So yeah, I do kind of think that there is. Because before we were talking about the Queen and her passing and the sort of historical element of the monarchy and what it represents. And I think that if you also look at US politics to this day, there is a certain classism inherent within the system. And that's been there since day one. So George Washington, everybody looks at as this, or all these historians, oh, what a lovely guy, blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah, sure, fantastic dude. Why not? Okay, he could be. But a lot of the problems that are inherent in Europe today, but that are also inherent in the United States today, I think stem from all of these sort of historical doctrines and in many ways these sort of policies of expansionism and classism. Essentially, it hasn't changed. You don't have kings, you don't have earls, you don't have barons, but we know you've got robber barons. But it's a bit different.
It's landowners. It's people who own property and like in the moment of the revolution, it's just people who are fighting to keep their land and to continue to grow their land. You know, like this is very much a war for landowners by land. Like in some cases, like I'd say in most cases it was done by landowners, but it was also just done by anybody who could do it, you know? Like if you were a young dude and you were capable, you were pretty much just thrown into the Continental Army because, well, we don't have a fucking army right now. Like everybody's getting fucking slapped in the face by the Brits, and we're trying our best to just kind of keep pushing boys out there. And like you got to get as many as you can get. And so like when George Washington did start the Continental Army, it was just a group of like random individuals who weren't particularly trained and didn't really know too much about like maybe some hunters and people who knew how to use weapons, but like they were not military trained whatsoever. Like these were people who were just like, I have my land and I've got a gun. I guess I'm gonna go fight the British because I agree with George Washington and I agree with like standing against that. And like it feels very much like this is just a war for one class. Like you said, like this is a class party, like this is a class war that's going on, and it is just for this class to just continue to expand. And we'll see in the future that they do, like dramatically and how many people get pushed out because of it. Like the Native Americans are not kindly treated at all throughout the course of American history. And what sucks is that like even a president later on, like much later on that I can think of that I feel as though is commended is going to like he even fucking mistreats the Native Americans. And it's just this fucking like we do not respect the land that we are on as Americans, and we just have continued to push the people who were here first out. And it's just painful to like that's what we did, and that's what it led to. It was like the Revolutionary War led to us being able to have our manifest destiny and continue to push out west. Like, and we pushed far, man, and we didn't stop. Many wars happened. It was not pretty.
Yeah, and this is also, as you say, a kind of burden that was carried by a number of presidents, and so we will look at this as we sort of go through our series
Yeah.
of at least 46 episodes. I think depending on when we finish, it may be 47 as well.
It
But
may
anyway,
be, yeah.
yeah, we'll see how that develops. Um, and also, it's important in the discussion of George Washington's presidency that you mention, obviously, the War of Independence, because I mean it started as taxation without representation.
Mm.
So people were working over there. They'd fled the Europe to sort of make a life for themselves, to sort of do whatever it was that they had to do, but then to have this expectation to then pay a certain amount of that profit to a person who lived, I don't know how many miles away, at some point became galling because their interests were not represented by the
Yeah.
crown. But then later on, so there was the war between France and England, and Washington chose to remain neutral in this particular
Yeah.
state. But then there was something called the Whiskey Rebellion. And this is a bit of a contradiction with regards to Washington, because
Is that also known as the Shays Rebellion? Or are
this I
those
don't know.
two different rebellions? I'm gonna look that up real quick. But keep
Yeah,
going, because
yeah.
I'm curious. Because I wrote something down about Shays Rebellion, and the whole time I was just like, that's interesting. Like, but keep going with the Whiskey Rebellion real quick.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that they introduced this tax on liquor, and people started then complaining, saying that, look, there's no taxation without representation. So they were saying that essentially you're taking more, or you want to take more money off us, but you're not representing our interests either. And
Yeah.
this is when he led, or he sent 12,000 volunteers into Pennsylvania to put down this particular rebellion. So I don't know if that's the exact same.
It's honestly, it's similar. They are different though. This
Okay.
so with Shays Rebellion, this one happened in 1787. And this was pretty close to the beginning of George Washington's presidency. Or no, actually, this wasn't even George Washington's presidency. This was during the time of the Articles of Confederation. So the Constitution hadn't even been a thing yet. But the Shays Rebellion, there were a bunch of people who, like a bunch of ex-military people who were in the Revolutionary War, and they were not being paid like they weren't being recompensated for their service. And they had debt collectors that were coming out because of the war, and they were only able to pay in hard currency. They weren't able to like take out loans anymore or anything like that. And so these like rural farmers are being like pulled to their ends. And like this dude Shay, he ends up getting like 20 to 30 dudes to just come down into like if I'm not mistaken, I think it's like the capital of New Hampshire. And he's just like, fuck these debt collectors, you can't do your job. He's pretty much just standing outside of the debt collecting office, and he's just like got his group of dudes, and they're not going to be able to do their job. And then George Washington gets General Knox to send roughly 1,200 dudes back down to the same place, and like artillery barrages them and until they just leave, and they ended up fucking off. But like, I just thought that that was really interesting that they were like, no, you're not allowed to get more money because you fought in my war. Like, I was just like, what the fuck? You fucking killed like 20 dudes just for that? Like, what the hell? And then, like, I mean, the result of that is the Constitution and George Washington becoming president, because it was like this moment of like, whoa, our national strength, like we cannot respond to things like this quickly, and so we need to come up with something to make that happen. And so like the result of Shays Rebellion is the Constitution and George Washington becoming president. But like, just fuck, man, what a wild thing to just be like, nope, thanks for fighting in my war, but fuck you anyway. Like, what the fuck, man? What a horrible thing to do to somebody. Like,
Yeah.
it tracks with how we treat like our veterans now still. Like, the current VA is really shitty. Like, if you worked in the CIA, a lot of the time, if like you end up like retiring from the CIA, you don't get compensation for working for the CIA because they can't show that you ever worked for the CIA. Like, it's one of those situations where it's just like, what the fuck, dude? I helped you out so much, but like, you're not even gonna fuck you. Like, what the fuck, man? That's crazy.
We may have to rename this episode the FUCK episode, but yeah, it's cool. As I referred to earlier, that you do you contribute a considerable amount of literal color. Yeah. So I mean, okay, it's not quite the same rebellion, but it's the same tactic employed
Yeah.
by Washington, and maybe this is where he sort of proves successful in these battles, because if somebody's got 20 people, then I'll bring 1,200 people, yeah, and if you're a few whiskey distillers, then I'm going to bring 12,000 guys, and I'm going to kick your ass. So
And I'm gonna kick you into
a
the dirt.
bit of a bully, I think we
Yeah.
can say, is old Mr. Washington, or Mr. President Washington over here. But this does kind of suggest that nothing really has changed, has it? It's you bully people into submission, and it doesn't matter about. I mean, people talk about morality, and people talk about him being a wonderful person. And also, it's interesting that he wasn't particularly religious. But this also comes up, I think, in some ways, to contribute to the fact that, okay, he may have had specific morals, but that morals could have changed to suit the situation that he desired. So
Yeah.
when those people were fighting for him, they were his guys.
Yeah.
But as soon as their interests sort of focused on their own just cause, then he didn't give a shit.
Yeah. It's very much I like using the people that he had when he needed them and then kind of just forgetting about them once you like the use was over. His like cabinet is a really interesting group of individuals because I think that General Knox really had a big influence on how he handled rebellions and things like that because like General Knox's philosophy was pretty much just like put it down before anything can happen. Like before anybody gets out of hand, it needs to be taken care of immediately. Like and so I imagine that that's why we see these drastic numbers of individuals come for really small people because it is a show of force and a show of like we have a country happening right now and you're gonna fuck with it, like fuck you. Here's an army that's gonna fuck your shit up. Like, and that's very much how it feels, and that's how it felt, is like just you're fucking with my plans, guys. Like, stop. And like I think luckily because of Shays Rebellion, like we did see the formulation of our constitution and like the articles of confederation finally like going away, but it's just this like oh my god, dude, just utilize the people that you have as soon as you have them, and as soon as they're just not useful, just fucking getting rid of them. And it's just like his cabinet is full of people who were all close to him for a long time, which is interesting, like General Knox, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and I can't remember the other guy's first name, but it's Randolph something, Edmund Randolph. These are all in like people who had kind of just been in Washington's life for a considerable amount of time, from like the Revolutionary War to Washington's end of presidency. So like it's not a huge amount of time, but that's a long amount of time to be with somebody in this time period and to develop a relationship and to like really have an influence on how you take care of situations, how you are like who you're talking to. Like your circle is going to influence how you take care of situations. Like my circle influences how I communicate, how I talk to people, how I behave. Like George Washington is in a similar situation with like his circle is also a bunch of just like rich white dudes who value their land and their property. And so we're going to see pretty much that perspective only for the United States to move forward. And it's like I feel like we don't really end up seeing any like diverse representation until much later on. And that's just like just shitty. Like,
Yeah.
just sucks.
We'll come to those obviously elements when we sort of move further into our presidential list. It's
Yeah.
interesting as well. I mean, we'll talk about Jefferson soon because obviously he has an episode to himself.
Yeah.
But Alexander Hamilton is one character who a lot has been attributed to him. So especially building the framework of the national banking system,
Mm.
and indeed the decision to take on the debt of the sort of 13 states, and just that policy of assumption, therefore allowing this sort of fledgling nation to grow, very much helped consolidate Washington's position.
Mm.
However, he was towards the end also unpopular. There were contrary voices to some of the decision making, and so it's not. Even though history has been sort of written, or at least a number of biographies have been written in a way which looks at him as though he was, I don't know, the sun shined out of his ass. Clearly, that wasn't always the case.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that goes for like, I mean, we're talking about Hamilton now, right?
No. I was talking about Washington, but you could talk about
Okay.
Hamilton too. We'll talk about all
I
of
mean,
them. They're all
honestly,
the same.
either way, like they're all like, yeah, they're all the same. Like it's they're pretty much all the same, like just white dudes that are all doing the same kind of shit. Like it, like that like I was like, I mean, yeah, that's all very true for Hamilton as well. Like that everybody kind of sees him as like this shining star, and like because I mean, there's a fucking musical about him that sheds not a lot of light on like the not so great things about him, and it's just kind of like we gloss over so much of this stuff, and the sun was definitely shining out of George Washington's ass. There's a photograph of that somewhere, I promise. um no, I think it's so interesting that we do just put so much praise on them and just so much like thanks for being the first president. I didn't ask you to. Like it feels like one of those things. You know what I mean? Like I don't need to celebrate you for doing something that I didn't really ask you to do, or don't like I'm not particularly fond of what you've done. Like I don't really enjoy America as it stands currently, so I'm I don't feel particularly fond towards many of these people. Like it's just the setup of like I'm excited to see like how these connections intertwine with like the future of America, because like this setup really is just like, yep, nope, this is what America is like very much still to this day. Like racist, misogynistic. We don't want to talk about slavery because it's definitely not a thing, but we still are like America still performs like it's difficult to talk about, but America does definitely still perform slavery to some degree. Like our prison system is fucking horrendous, and like people do work like our forced labor camps in prisons, and like it's not framed that way, and it's very particularly framed not framed that way, but there like in the South in particular there are many people, and specifically black people, that are in prison for like practically nothing, that are forced to work without any compensation. And like we act like slavery's dead, we act like the purchasing of individuals is dead, but like in a lot of ways it really hasn't changed that much, because there are still people who are forced to work and are forced into these situations that they shouldn't be in, and very much because of their race and who they are as an individual, like just because they look different than me. And like it's just such a fucked up thing. Like you look at it in the past and it just hasn't changed. Like we think about all this progress that has happened in the past century and a half, and even longer. Like I mean, the past century and a half is only like 1850, 1860. So like going back further and further, it's just nothing has changed. We haven't made much progress. It feels so like we're still so behind. And like the idea of America being the shining beacon for the world, for from the time like for as long as America's been a thing, like America has never stood for the right reasons. And George Washington certainly didn't. Like this America that we're talking about today, like on this episode, did not stand for the right reasons. Like it's really weird to look at it and just be like, fuck, man, nothing has changed. Why? Like what? And then you get to this place where it's just like, what do you do? Like, what are we supposed to do when things just aren't changing? Like, I don't know. It's tough. It's tricky.
Yeah, I tell you, there are so many things that you mentioned there. I think we could keep on going for hours, but I mean, we'll have to start to reel it in. But I mean,
Yeah.
just to mention a couple of additional facts with regards to George Washington. So I mean, he was a very sickly president. He suffered from lots and lots of diseases. He may have even he almost died, I think, and perhaps would not have even been able to continue as a president quite early on, I think, in his life.
Yeah.
I think he at the end he only had one tooth that was his own. From what some of the stuff that I've read, he had a horse's tooth. He had teeth from other people, perhaps from some of his slaves. But he didn't have a wooden tooth. I'm reliably informed.
Yes.
He wrote letters prodigiously, perhaps up to about 18,000 of them, one of which he sent as a love letter to his best friend's wife, Sally Fairfax.
That's fucking hilarious.
So and he probably produced more whiskey than any one individual in the history of whiskey production. So 11,000 gallons.
Then to put down a whiskey rebellion.
Yeah.
Sounds pretty hypocritical.
Yeah, so it's that's quite a bit.
In regards to his letters, I read a really cool little story about there was this enslaved woman who ended up learning, like being given the opportunity to learn Latin and Greek and English, and she could read and write and speak it very well. And she ended up writing George Washington a letter at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. And George Washington actually sent a letter back to her, like, miss her name, which was super uncommon for the time, like being really respectful to the woman who was enslaved. And I was just like, that is a really, like, I'm sure that this is just like a cherry picked thing, but like I was just like, that's kind of a cool, like, cool little story. Like he wrote a lot of fucking letters. Like there's so many documents out there of George Washington's that, like, and he just, everything that he wrote is interesting, and in my opinion it's worth reading just for like the way that he can communicate, because I think George Washington had a very specific way of writing and communicating that felt really unique. And a lot of the stuff that I've always read of his, I've been like, you do seem like you kind of know what you're talking about. Like you've got like a good head in there somewhere. It's just fucking clouded by all this other shit. Like, well spoken, well read. Like, I think that just happens for people. Like, you can still be a horrible person and be well read and well spoken.
Well, I mean, I think exactly that particular characterization is, also exemplified in this letter that he wrote to Sally Fairfax. So at the beginning, he talks about his love for a person, and then halfway through, he decides, "Oh, screw it, come on, it's you." And so therefore, there is this kind of sort of almost a literary approach where you build up an element of excitement, and then boom, there's the twist. So yeah, he could also perhaps have become quite an interesting fiction writer.
Oh man, that honestly, I think I'd be more cool with that. He would have just fucking fucked off to Mount Vernon and wrote some like sci-fi or fiction or something.
Yeah, but then the slaves might not have appreciated his presence there the whole time.
But, he just sits there and he's like, "Work, do something. I do not like this. I gotta write."
Yeah, writers can be quite interesting characters. But let's come back to this one. This was one final element which he's been really highly praised for, because somebody who didn't crave power was that he decided at the end of his second term that he would not run for re-election.
Right.
Now, I think that's partially because he probably wasn't in the best of health, as has been sort of explained. And there are many, I suppose, other references which talk about this. I think he just couldn't be bothered anymore. There was a lot of disharmony in the government and in the area. People didn't really feel that. I think he was driving them in the right direction.
Yeah.
But this is represented now as his sacrifice because he didn't want to be the person in the throne or sitting on the throne, and I think that's also potentially slightly bending reality a bit. How do you see it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's bent in this, like it's altered very slightly, because I mean it's not the truth. You know what I mean? Like he didn't want to continue after his second term, so they can be like he made the great sacrifice of stepping down, and it's one of those things of just like, no, this dude was fucking sick. He was having like heart attacks in office. He was coughing his heart out. Like, homeboy is not in good shape. Like, and when you got one tooth, nobody wants you to be president. Just being honest. That's fucking gross and weird. Like, prove me wrong, but sounds not great. But like, he just, his sacrifice is him getting too tired and too old and too sick to keep going, that he's like, and now I'm gonna be done. Like, that's not a sacrifice. You can just call that retirement or something. Like, just like, I quit my job. I don't know, unemployment. Like, it's something, man. Like, it's not a sacrifice, because it just isn't. Like, you're not stepping down for a noble cause. It wasn't because you were like, somebody else should take my place because I don't want to have all this power. I'd just be too much. It was just I'm sick. I'm tired. I'm ready to go back to Mount Vernon and die in 3 years. Like, and so like John Adams steps in and becomes next president. Like, it ends up just being this weird fucking like framing of how it was done in the past, but just like framing it so that way it seems like this heroic action. Like, everything is framed for George Washington to be a heroic action, even stepping down from office. Like, that is seen as such a great thing, and it's weird, man. It's weird.
Yeah, and another snippet of information, whether or not this is completely true, it doesn't matter at this stage, who cares? But apparently in 1789, his presidential salary represented 2% of the total US budget. So
Damn.
clearly the budget wasn't particularly great at the time.
Yeah.
However, 2%, I think this term 2% is something that we should consider later on as well. Because the number 2 and percent does figure in some kinds of decision making later on in US history, especially in finance. Okay. Aydan, before we go, because we're already approaching the hour mark, we're going to make this really scientific, and we're going to grade our 46 up to now presidents.
Yeah.
So out of 100, where do you rate Mr. Washington?
You know, it's hard because he's not great. He's not horrible. Like, we're going to be getting into really fucking skeezy presidents in the future. So I don't want to like shoot him real low right out the gate, cuz he is kind of like, I'd say in the middle, but more on the lower end of the middle. So like, I'm going to sit with a comfortable 43. Actually, no, I take that back. 37. 37 was my initial feel, but it felt a little too low, but I'm going to go with my gut. 37.
Okay, 37 out of 100.
Yeah, I'm going to write
George
that
Washington.
down.
Yeah, so the original GW gets 37 out of
What about,
100.
how do you feel about it?
Do you know, I'm going to go with you on that one. I think it's a bit low. To be honest, I would have rated him higher than that. I'd have put him comfortably in the 50s.
Yeah,
But I'm happy to go with 37. To hell with it. You know, just you've
I
got to live a little, right?
I don't want I just don't think that he really was all that impressive. And in a lot of my research, I was just like, this is just a lucky dude with a lucky spawn point, with a good set of cards that he had, or just like he played his cards right, you know, like, and I I can't commend you for being lucky. I just have to commend you on your actions as an individual. And 37 points is decent. I think we're gonna get into some people who are gonna be definitely below 37.
I think so. I think we may even have to establish some minus
Yeah, I was like,
scales as well
can we
for
get
some.
into the negative?
I think we may actually venture into that particular area because, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now but that's really interesting though, because if we start with George Washington at 37 out of 100, then that makes it extremely interesting to see how some of the other presidents later on figure
Well,
in that
a-
analysis.
and I think like for a perfect 100, like man, that I don't think that that's possible. And I think that even getting into the 90s, like being a good president is a fucking hard task. And I think that like placing George Washington at 37 is only to exemplify that it is such a difficult task and that it is just simply not going to happen. Like you can't have a president who is like, I'm the bee's knees. I'm awesome all the time. Like, no, there is not a single one. Even the people that I think are cool are not cool. Like, my favorite president is not a good president. That's just the
Mm.
truth. We're definitely going to be getting into the negative, and in my opinion, we might even be getting there within the next 2 episodes. We'll see. We'll
Okay.
see.
Yeah, cool. Okay. Brilliant. Aidan, what can I say? You entertain during, and I'm gonna I'm gonna find it really entertaining editing as well, to be honest.
Sweet.
Yeah, but thank you very much. Thanks for your
Yeah.
insight, your research, your efforts, your thoughts, and also just your very, very sincere and straightforward speech.
Thank you very much, Zach. I always appreciate coming here. It's such a fun time.
Excellent. All the best to you. See you next time.
Yeah, to you as well.
Two and a mic.